In a bombshell admission, the former national security advisor to Donald Trump has admitted the US were involved in a number of coups around the world. John Bolton made the confession during an interview to CNN.
One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but, other places, it takes a lot of work.
A big surprise that John Bolton, a former national security advisor, would actually call a spade when it comes to Washington's decades-long tendency of overthrowing governments around the world that it doesn't like. But to introduce this idea that the U.S. orchestrates coup d'etats in other countries on a mainstream media outlet like CNN, I mean, that could really, like you said, open Pandora's box in terms of how people view the legitimacy of Washington's foreign policy decisions. We've already seen Bolton's comments draw quite a bit of criticism from the U.S.'s European allies on Twitter already. And, I mean, do you remember Juan Guaido, America's yes man, who basically tried to overthrow the Venezuelan government several years ago? I mean, he's definitely going to look a lot less like a freedom fighter now and a lot more like a foreign agent to your average American. And Bolton even called Venezuela's government an illegally elected government.
I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful. Not that we had all that much to do with it, but I saw what it took for an opposition to try and overturn an illegally elected president, and they failed.
We have to understand that Bolton's admission of failure in Venezuela, his admission that Washington organizes coup d'etats around the world, I mean, this all actually flies in the face of what former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said back in 2019. As the Venezuelan government was in a life and death struggle over the country's sovereignty, Pompeo said that the U.S. did not get directly involved in this at all. Now it looks pretty undeniable that the U.S. was actually quite involved in Guaido's movement, the same movement that ended with an attempt by armed men to take over the government, in which a number of people were killed, and even two American former Special Forces soldiers were arrested there.
Well, just breaking all that down, Don, countries that accuse the US of meddling, their claims must be seen in a whole new light now, surely.
That's true. I mean, these are not new claims that the U.S. has been involved in this or that uprising around the world. I mean, we saw mass protests in Hong Kong in the same year that they were actually taking place in Venezuela. And back then, Beijing said that the U.S. was stoking the flames of those protests there. And Bolton's statements just lend more legitimacy to that claim. Just this year, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, he was ousted from power amid a constitutional crisis. And he says that the U.S. was behind his removal because he tried to maintain a non-aligned foreign policy. So with all this political chaos around the world, and one way or another connected to the U.S. government, it shouldn't come as much as a surprise that a lot of African countries and Asian countries are weary about being connected with the United States, especially when the United States is trying to get them on the anti-Russian sanctions bandwagon. I mean, their leaders see what happens when American influence is tolerated in countries, and then the authorities there make one wrong move that Washington doesn't like.
And let me just bring you back a few years, Don. The Maidan uprising of 2014 in Ukraine. Will that now be considered a coup by the West as well?
Well, that's possibly the case. I mean, back when it took place back in 2014, many people saw it as a coup d'etat back then as well. I mean, it's no secret that the former Undersecretary of European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, in cooperation with the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time in 2014, they did all they could to guide the Ukrainian opposition movement where they wanted it to go. And this is only one of the reasons why Russia's foreign minister at the time called Maidan an outright coup d'etat.
We call it a coup d'etat, which took place the morning after France, Poland, and Germany signed an agreement between the then president and opposition leaders.
What ramifications can John Bolton's confession now have?
Well, it's unlikely that level-headed leaders of sovereign nations around the world are ever going to entirely trust American diplomats and American politicians ever again. I mean, in dealing with the United States, it's not going to be clear whether the American politicians are going to be conducting diplomacy with them in good faith, or if they have some sort of alternative agenda, perhaps a coup d'etat up their sleeve. And what's even more shocking is that Bolton was not the first one to open this can of worms. Earlier this year, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, explained how America teased and lied to Ukraine about NATO membership.
In 2021, we kept reiterating that Ukraine was going to join. We kept saying that over and over again. So our diplomats are lying?
Yes. Yes, that's the real world, guys. Come on.
So if it wasn't already glaringly obvious how the U.S. views its dealings with other people around the world, I mean, these recent statements by these top U.S. officials should really be one heck of a wake-up call.
Don Corder speaking to me earlier. Now, political economist Tim Anderson believes the practice of orchestrating coups abroad is nothing new to Washington and has roots going way back.
Coups are not simply mechanical things. They involve murder, sometimes the murders of many thousands of people. And Bolton, of course, has a track record of being involved in fabricating evidence for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, for involvement in the several attempts at a coup in Venezuela a few years ago. When he was UN ambassador, he was covering up the crimes of apartheid Israel in terms of the expansion of the colonies in the Palestinian West Bank and the massacre of civilians. It's known that there's a very long history of coups by US administrations for many years. There's always a fear of the US because of its impunity, because of its brutality, and now in terms of the so-called sanctions, countries are having second thoughts about simply going along with anything that Washington says. That's why we see countries that have been relatively independent of this, such as India and Brazil, now not wanting to buy into the economic warfare that Washington is insisting that everyone does against Russia.